My guest this week is Deb Filman, host of the Reason We Learn podcast, a podcast that focuses on the issues facing education today in America. And I know we talk a lot about education here, but it is a very important hot button issue. And there's so many layers to it. So there's so many factors of education you can talk about. I like to think that I was one of the first out here when everyone was talking about politics and elections, talking about the culture. But I have to say, in talking about the culture, I talk a lot about education. I've had a lot of guests on, and I've been talking about that, school choice, what's wrong in schools, even in the private schools. But I think Deb is one of those people who've been talking about this even longer than me. And on her website, she makes some really interesting points. She says, schooling discourages critical thinking. Schooling is organized around adults, not kids. That's really important. That's true. And it leads to a lot of our problems. And lastly, individualized education encourages critical thinking. So she has a very unique take on these problems. And I look forward to discussing that with her. We talk about all those problems, how she got involved, and what we should do about what's going on. Deb, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on.
So we kind of connected in a roundabout way. We ended up meeting in person, but I had seen some of your stuff. I guess you mine, but we had never met. And after meeting you and speaking with you and looking at more of your videos, I'm like, this might be the only person that talks about education more, if not as much as me. So I guess I want to start out with why the Reason We Learn and why you started vocalizing the issues within education.
Well, I started the Reason We Learn initially because I felt like the work I was doing locally in my community to try to raise awareness about problems in education was just not working. I began it when I had to put my kids into the public school system because I was homeschooling them, and then their dad and I separated, and that was pretty much what the court told me I had to do. And I was really upset about it because I was homeschooling them intentionally. Started that process in about 2008 or so. And I didn't want them in the public school. I had been a school teacher. I'd seen from the inside out what was wrong with it in terms of the curriculum, in terms of the standards and all that. And this is before things were hardcore woke. I was just dissatisfied with the quality. I didn't like the methodologies. I didn't like the pedagogy and stuff. So I left teaching in the early 90s for that reason. And then I wanted to homeschool my own kids. So when I had to put them in the school, I became very active, volunteered in the school, tutored, wanted to be as eyes on, hands on as I could possibly be, so I could speak intelligently at school board meetings and that kind of stuff. You know, if I wasn't going to teach in the districts, I didn't want to do that. I was at least going to be present. That was not working. I was speaking up as much as I could. I didn't often get to speak at school board meetings because they kind of saw me coming and I was not, given the mic. Mm-hmm. And things get real crowded here in Charlotte. So it's not like everybody who goes can talk. And I would just try to get little groups of people together locally to talk to them, people in my kids' classes. I even checked voting lists, like who voted Republican. That's a weird way to do it, but I just figured, okay, maybe these people are more receptive to what I'm seeing, to hearing what I'm saying. And I would get people privately agreeing with me and saying, I agree with you. And this is crazy. And I don't like it. And then by this point, this is now 2000, let's say 14, 15. I had my kids in a charter school. I moved them thinking maybe this will be better. No, it was just worse. It actually got worse. They put up a song and dance about what they were going to do academically and socially, and both were 180 degrees from reality. But I found very quickly that there was even less oversight, no school board meeting to go to. The board was somewhat invisible, and the parents were scared. And now let's go back to, this is now 2016. By this point, I'm really aggressively talking to people. Parents are like, no, couldn't possibly say anything. So around 2020, after I kept doing it, I kept trying to talk to people, still wasn't working. I finally said, that's it. People aren't listening to me here. I know it's not just Charlotte. This is happening all over the country. We're not unique. I'm just going to throw up a YouTube channel and start talking even into the void. And let's see, maybe if there are people who are like me. In other words, they're willing to speak up. They're willing to say something. They'll watch a video. Maybe they'll talk to another person. We can force multiply across the country better than I can do in my backyard. And I had no idea if anyone would watch or listen, but I just said, I got to do it because I felt compelled. You just feel like you have a calling to do something. And education's always been a passion of mine. That's why I went into teaching in the first place. That's why I was homeschooling. I truly believe everything's downstream from education. It's everything. And so it was just a passion that made me do it. And it just kind of grew and grew and grew. And here we are.
So we're going to get into, I'm quite sure, race and gender, because it's all the rage today. Wow. It's like 1947.
Yeah,
but,
right.
I think that it's important to talk about what started you on your quest, because I talk about that often. You and I, cross paths, in tweets and in conversations where we see other people kind of missing the boat on this a bit. Mm-hmm. So I want to talk about you started looking into this because there were failing issues. There were issues of curriculum and things that weren't going well. So if we remove race and gender and just talk about that, there are problems that have been brewing for a while in the quality of education. So talk about some of the things that were missing, some of the problems that you saw, and just how schools across the country are doing a disservice to kids.
Sure. I would start with lack of attention on grades K through 3 and development of reading, literacy, real literacy. We talk so much about literacy, but the science of reading has been ignored for about 50 years. What do I mean by the science of reading? Teaching phonics. That's the most straightforward way to put it. Just not done. And I think what surprised me, because obviously I went into teaching at, 89, 90, I went to graduate school. They taught us that whole word junk. And I remember thinking, this is whack. But I thought, I was sort of naive. I thought, well, this is what the fancy graduate school is pushing, and I don't have to do that. Like, I figured this is this newfangled thing. Like in college, they taught us a bunch of junk that I ignored. So I figured I'll go into teaching and I'll use phonics because I know it works better and that'll be fine. It didn't dawn on me that they were teaching this to me and it was going to be prescribed. Like, you must do this. It's not, here's another way to go about teaching reading that you can use or ignore, you, the teacher, the professional. And found myself face to face with doing something that I knew with every fiber of my being was not going to work. And it's tough when you're in a profession where, especially when you're dealing with children, and this is a vital skill to everything in their lives, especially their academic success. And you're teaching first and second grade. It's what I was teaching. And you're basically prohibited from doing it the right way. That makes a lot of people want to quit. So I did. But it was the reading. It was how we were doing it, the way we were grouping kids, and also not treating them as individuals who needed to learn skills. Instead, everything was getting done in a group, math in a group, reading in a group, all this holistic lack of knowledge. We didn't have a knowledge-based curriculum. So I have started to see kids who didn't know anything. And again, we're going back to the 90s here. We're not talking about the 2010s and on. We're talking about kids who weren't being taught basic geography. They weren't being taught spelling. They weren't being taught grammar. And that has been, there are people now who are teaching who were my students or could have been my students. They are now teachers. And so I've been aware of this. I've been watching this, aware of this, and it has, affected my attitude towards, what's going on. And I think it's why we have the ideological problems in our school, because if you don't have knowledge and you don't have the skills to get knowledge, reading, writing, math, all that stuff, basic scientific method, then anyone could pass anything off on you. The people who have those skills, who can read the books or who are reading the books or who are told by other people who read books, this is so, become the foremost authorities on knowledge. And you just have to take what they say. You don't have a framework to argue. So this is why you begin to accept the ridiculous that, oh, a boy could be a girl could be a boy. And, yes, we must go back to segregating races and all kinds of things because you can't read the differences. Right. You don't have those skills.
Coming up, more with Deb Filman, host of the Reason We Learn podcast. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
We return to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer. Once again, here's Charles Love.
Are you tired of summer nights in May?
Welcome back. I am continuing my conversation with Deb Filman, host of the Reason We Learn podcast. And in this segment, we talk about how bad things have really gotten in schools. And we all hear the noise today about gender and race and separating kids. And some people think DEI is great. Some people are angry. But the real problem is the lack of education and the failing schools are not new. So I asked Deb why we're not talking about the academic decline that we're facing in schools.
Well, you've got probably how many people is it now? How many millions of teachers are there in the country? Mm-hmm. It's 1.7 million or some crazy number. So what percentage of them at this point, since we know a lot of the seasoned older teachers who are trained, the old fashioned way, who taught the old fashioned way, have either retired or about to retire or have just plain quit. Even some of the younger teachers who were hard nosed and wanted to do it the traditional knowledge based way are quitting. I personally know quite a few of them. So you've got a lot of people whose jobs depend on not talking about it. You've got unions that depend for their power on those people wanting to keep those jobs. So at this point, there are incentives that disincentivize talking about it, or at a minimum, when it gets talked about, incentivize blaming it on everybody but the schools. So we blame the parents, we blame the society, we blame lack of money, we blame racism, we blame, all these extraneous things. And, when it comes right down to it, when you close the door and it's you, the teacher, and the kids in the classroom, especially in elementary school, you've got those kids for 7-8 hours. What they learn or don't learn, really, that buck needs to stop at your desk. Even if it means, because like I was precluded from teaching the right way, so I quit. Okay. I tried getting other teachers to come with me and complain and talk about that. They laughed at me. So, I don't begrudge anyone quitting, but that's at least a step, you're voting with your feet against this kind of madness. I then went out and tried to tutor privately and broadcast to people what was going on to get parents aware. But if you don't want to see the truth for one reason or another, you're not going to see it. It could be smacking you in the face. But there it is. And there's just a lot of money and a lot of power tied up in not talking about it.
So now we have this large percentage of teachers who have been taught the wrong way and learned the wrong way. And then they've been indoctrinated in education schools across the country.
Right.
So they come in with their marching orders. The kids were already being failed academically by removing certain classes and changing them to other things. Now, what we call woke or CRT or whatever label, I'm not a label guy. Now the bad social views are being pushed into the schools, where now we have to focus on race and gender identity and things of that nature. And all these things that have nothing, regardless of your views on them, have nothing to do with the quality of education of the kids' ability to do math, to read, to learn about the government and things of that nature. So talk about how layering that on top of what was already bad has compounded the problem.
Well, it's compounded the problem because it has created, it's not an impression anymore. They've flat out said it out loud. The teachers union, in fact, is meeting right now as we speak, and their priorities as listed are social justice and social justice. So the teachers union has made it clear to their audience of teachers that academics is not the priority. By adding this layer on top of the academic problems, it just solidifies that. It makes it crystal clear academic success of the individual variety is not the priority of education in America. It's simply not. And this is the biggest shock when I talk to parents about this. This hits them the hardest. They're not really shocked that academic quality has fallen off and that grades are inflated. They're not really shocked anymore by the low literacy rates, which is tragic that this is all becoming so commonplace. Nobody's shocked anymore that in the United States of America, we have only 30% of kids who are graduating high school proficient at reading and math. But what does shock them is that the goals they have for sending their kids to school and the goals the schools have are so divergent that at this point, they're not even pretending anymore that individual academic success, as we would measure it in terms of proficiency, is the goal. Okay. Their goal is equal outcomes as measured by grades they admit are being tailored now in some districts specifically by race, if not by historically marginalized status or intersectional identity. So even the measure of success, even the rubric to define the outcome that they want to be equal isn't what parents thought it was going to be. Those A's aren't A's like you think an A is. And they want them all to have those A's. So what is it an A in? Well, it's an A in things like showing up and participating in your group work and being as compassionate, empathetic, blah, 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 or whatever the prescribed behaviors, thought patterns, attitudes are. You did that enough, you get an A. Mm-hmm. Maybe couldn't read very well. You maybe can't write, maybe don't. That's not the priority. And you say this to people and they just don't believe you until you can show them somebody like Becky Pringle or Randy Weingarten saying that I'm right. I mean, that just explaining it. It's true.
And see, that's what I think. There's a lot of problems, but the biggest problem is the answer to this simple question, because I know the answer, but I'm asking because you're the guest and I'm the host, so I don't have to do all the talking. Do parents even know? See, the problem is the parents don't know, and I can't even blame them. I mean, my goal is to get people to understand things that they're not being told. But the things talk about how these things, one, are framed in ways that they sound nice. So as a parent busy all day, just reads them. Oh, that sounds nice. One. So it doesn't sound, unless you're paying attention to this, it doesn't sound as toxic as it is. So your red flags don't necessarily go up. And then there's grade inflation. So you're getting A's for nonsense, but it doesn't matter. So you send your kids to school. You're like, do your work. You better get good grades. And they're like, Mom, I'm bringing you A's and B's. Get off my back. So you put those two together, and most of the parents, it's not even that they agree with it. They don't know, right?
Yes, they don't know. Like I said, the people who have changed education right under their nose to a completely different project have changed the vocabulary they use to talk about education. So even the word success doesn't mean what you think it does. The word grade doesn't mean what you think it does. None of it means what you think it does. For example, if they talk about some of the things they're putting as a priority above and beyond memorizing your multiplication tables or even learning to read proficiently, they will talk about the social and emotional skills that are essential for the child's readiness to learn. Okay. And they'll talk about that. Sounds nice, doesn't it? Sounds like, well, yeah, my child needs to be ready to learn. Or the mindset the child needs to have. They need to have a growth mindset in order to learn. And they'll make these statements. And of course, they have degrees and they have titles, principal or counselor or teacher, whatever. And parents are already busy and just trying to keep gas in the tank, that be able to afford to go to the job anymore at this point. They're hearing this stuff and they're thinking, okay, well, they're the experts and they're saying that in order for my kid to learn, they have to first do these layers of things that I never heard of before. Now add in, there was COVID. That was traumatic. That was terrible. So we have to have extra of this to prepare them to learn and get them over all these mental health problems. It's easy to believe. It's easy to believe that my child can't learn unless and until. And what I want parents to understand is that is a lie. Those things are only true statements for a teeny tiny subset of students. And what we used to know or do is take that teeny tiny subset who are demonstrating symptoms. They're demonstrating, I can't learn because I cannot manage my emotions and I am all over the place. And we would take them and we would individually remediate what was going on. And they might see a counselor and we dealt with them as the little individual humans with problems that they are. Now we're taking it as a blanket curriculum and saying all the students need this remediation preemptively, even if they've got a happy home life and parents pay attention and they're really not facing any particular trauma. We're going to treat them like they are, same for everybody. So it's a giant waste of time at the very best. at worst, it's kind of projecting a lot of negative stuff onto a bunch of kids about what it takes to learn. How's your mood? What's going on? Da, 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 da. Instead of approaching kids like, of course you can do this. And so I tell parents, remember back when your kid learned to walk? Remember when your kid learned to hold a spoon or an actual cup instead of a sippy cup? Remember how they learned to do that? Did you have to first have a little mood chat with them and make sure they were ready to understand the challenge of standing up and walking? Or were they self-motivated to move to the next level? Well, guess what? Most kids are. Mm-hmm. And I just want to reacquaint parents with the reality they deep down know, but they're blinded by what I call white lab coat syndrome or degree syndrome, credential syndrome. They know better than me because credentials. Yep. No, you know your kid.
Coming up, more with Deb Filman, host of the Reason We Learn podcast. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer, with your host, Charles Love.
Welcome back. I am continuing my conversation with Deb Filman, host of the Reason We Learn podcast. And in the last segment, we talked about how before all of this new DEI stuff hit the schools, people were struggling academically. So here we talk about, if that's the case, don't they know that focusing on an all-encompassing history of racism and focusing on gender issues on top of poor academic achievement is a guaranteed fail? And if so, why are they doing it?
The question I've started asking people, and it's not my question, other people have asked it, is who benefits? Mm-hmm. So, and there are lots of different kinds of benefits, and there are a lot of different people who could be benefiting from saying these kinds of things that are, factually incorrect and provably so. Let's face it, if you have a job that doesn't really provide you a lot of reward in terms of feeling good about yourself or whatever, and you're told this is how you derive virtue in this society is by helping others, is by, liberating other people, being a good person, being an ally, being all this stuff. And you're the type of individual who wanted to go into a helping profession. So you're kind of already a little bit primed personality type to want to be helpful. And then B, maybe not the deepest thinker in the world. I'm sorry to say, but that's just the fact. You're more of a person who you're compassionate, you're empathetic, whatever, and you want to be a helper. You perceive that reward. You get the reward of, I'm so helpful. I'm so caring. I'm so wonderful when you help these kids. So what we've kind of done is we've taken school, we've turned it into a kind of pseudo church. We've created the new holy and the new sacraments, if you will. And these folks fancy themselves disciples or some kind of apostles, if you will, and they're going out and they genuinely think they are doing this amazingly virtuous, wonderful thing. That's a certain percentage. And I think it's probably a high percentage. Then you have a percentage who are true believers in the underlying political agenda of these kinds of messages, which is that you're not going to have the world that they want, whatever the heck that is, without turning the children. In other words, if the children are left to grow up as individuals in the care of parents who don't agree with these agenda, we're not going to get there. So we got to turn the kids to our service, to our purposes. This has been done since time immemorial. I mean, every political ideology that ever tried to shift masses of people all at once used children. So you've got that percentage of people. And then, of course, we've got the one that's always there, which is money. There's a lot of money to be made preaching this kind of nonsense. You've got whole consultancies that are built on DEI. You've got people who, for some reason, still get a paycheck over at the New York Times, writing books that are, basically fiction and running around preaching about what, Black people are and aren't, what history is and isn't. And no matter how much they get challenged, doesn't matter. They still get paid. And they're making lots of money and they're making other people lots of money to perpetuate these narratives. So there's a lot of money at this point in our culture and our society in a certain kind of knee-jerk activism that doesn't require any thought and that will not tolerate any debate. And I think all three of those things are coming together in the education world to our kids' detriment. And the parents, either were similarly educated, so they're kind of not really all that clear on what's wrong. They kind of perceive in their gut something's not right, but they can't conceptualize it because they too were deprived of proper education, and or they are so busy just trying to make a living, keep the lights on, keep the rent paid, et cetera, that they're just plain busy. They don't have time. I, who know what's going on, just like you, who spend my days poring over these documents, looking at this stuff, am still learning every day. Every day I discover something new that they're twisting about language, that they're turning in the curriculum. And I have to go back to something I said a week ago, saying, no, I was wrong. It really actually is this bad. So if I'm finding that and I'm spending as my avocation, like all my time doing this, I can't expect parents to be as up on it. And then add, there's intentional attempt to hide it, which we know we've had school districts exposed in the last year for explicitly directing the teachers not to tell parents things, to hide things in Chromebook, Google Classroom things where the parents can't find it. They've changed the words around, et cetera. So this is why it's happening. And your point about your son is so important, because the people with the most power to change it, ironically, are the students. They have the greatest degree of freedom of speech in this equation. It's been said so by the Supreme Court. If they're polite, obviously respectful about it, but they can challenge the teacher without any kind of legal consequence. Now, I can't promise you that the teacher is not going to fail them in a class, but they're the ones, more even than the parents, who have something to say about what they're being taught in the classroom. The problem, of course, is that they're doing it for younger and younger and younger kids, and you can't expect a 6-year-old, even a 10-year-old, to stick up for him or herself when presented with some of these ideas. As I said, there is no knowledge-based curriculum anymore. Mm-hmm. A 10-year-old, when you and I were kids, might have been able to pull off some of the stuff, especially in the race type of situation, might have had the vocabulary to say, I don't know, teach. I don't think so. And let me tell you why I don't think so. I remember in 4th grade, I did a whole paper on the Civil War and wrote it in longhand. Okay. Most kids today in 4th grade are like the what war? So they don't have the knowledge to, let's say, push back on the 1619 Project at all.
Coming up, more with Deb Filman, host of the Reason We Learn podcast. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
Now, more of The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer, with your host, Charles Love.
Welcome back. I am continuing my conversation with Deb Filman, host of the Reason We Learn podcast. And we've talked about the problems and the things they're pushing in schools that are detrimental to the children. And here we take a turn. We talk about her interesting views on school choice and what it means to be a school abolitionist.
Well, full disclosure, once upon a time, I might have been one of those people who was like, yeah, it's the civil rights issue of our time, school choice. But as I've been doing all this research and digging into it and understanding the real structure of schools and the education world state by state, how the laws get made and enforced and so forth around education, and the fact that private schools have fallen down too. You know, it used to be once upon a time, you think, oh, private school is always better. And I've now since learned in some cases, actually in many cases, if we look at the 1900 schools in the NAIS, the National Association of Independent Schools, that are even more woke than the public schools, with less transparency, I've changed my mind and gotten super skeptical. So here's where I start, Charles. I start with this premise that freedom in terms of parenting and education, I think, is part of parenting. So I start there. My right as a parent to decide how my child will be educated is as fundamental as my right to decide how to be fed. Somebody doesn't come to me the day my child is born and demand to know whether I plan to breastfeed or formula feed. They also don't come to me and demand to know which grocery store I plan to shop at, how often, and what products I plan to buy. Okay, so these things don't happen. Nobody's standing over, with an authority over my feeding choice of my kids. And feeding's about survival, right? I mean, education is really important. It's right up there, close second, but it's, not live or die. Okay. And yet we have accepted the premise for 150 years or so, I don't know, give or take. We've accepted the premise that it is perfectly appropriate for our state government to decide how our children will be educated. We've just accepted that. We've accepted a thing called compulsory school is a given in our lives as parents and for children, that their childhood will be taken up for approximately 13 years with this thing called schooling. And I'm the one who goes all the way back to it and says, oh, hold on a moment. Is that true? It may be legally true. In other words, somebody decided a long time ago that this was okay, but do I agree? And my answer is no, I do not agree. I do not agree any more than I would agree if they suddenly woke up tomorrow and said, some parents don't feed their kids properly. So we got to have this, feeding thing. And so given that as my starting point, when I'm looking at parental rights, I then start to say, okay, who has the authority to give me choices? To give me choices, right? And the school choice is predicated on the notion that, first of all, government deciding there's a thing called school and how many years you got to go to it is appropriate. And then government deciding how much, because they're even school choice are talking about something called school funding or education dollars. They frame it that way. And I'm sitting there like, I'm sorry, why are they sequestered education dollars and school dollars? It's like, we've accepted the premise that the government gets to appropriate, or in this case, take through taxes the defined amount of money that could change based on elections. In other words, based on voting, this body of people gets to decide how much to take from me, whether I have kids or not, whether I'm using it or not, to pay for something called school, which they also define and run and regulate. And I'm way back behind all these people going, no, I disagree that that's okay. So if you come at me with the good news, the government has decided to agree to allowing you to apply for some school dollars or education dollars that was your money and it's now being run through this middleman, and there's some churn there too, to get it back so that you can have some more of the options of things they call school to put your kids in. I'm not going to be like, yay. I'm going to start with skepticism because remember, I don't accept the original premise.
So let's talk about that then. So are you a school abolitionist?
I am.
But yeah,
to be fair, I'm a compulsory school abolitionist. I'm a government school abolitionist. I'm not for outlawing school.
Yeah, not teaching people. Right. Exactly. That's what I'm saying. Explain what that means.
Okay. So what that means is that I think education, just like feeding, is the province of the parents. If a group of people in a city or a county, whatever, said, that's all well and good, Deb, but there are going to be these kids who don't have parents, it's foster kids, there's all kinds of kids, they don't have parents, and what are we going to do about them? Well, there's two things I say to that. First thing is, that's not really my obligation to solve that problem. As a parent, my obligation is to take care of the children I put on this planet. However, if you ask me as a decent human being, a caring human being who loves and cares about children, then I would say, I think that we as a locality should talk about some options where we can voluntarily contribute to it and incentivize contribution. Maybe there's tax breaks or awards of things to people who want to set things up to provide for that and so forth. That if we want to get together and say there really needs to be something for those kids, I could get on board with that. And especially if I weren't being milked from the time I got my first job at the age of, 18 to pay for other people's kids, maybe I'd have some extra money to contribute to it. So I don't think this is an either or. Problem is I'm presented with it as an either or. You have to have public schooling or kids won't get educated. No, if we said that about walking, then we'd be saying in 10 years, nobody knew how to walk before we had schools teaching them. So I think it just means restoring full parental rights to save for and provide for that education, and then leave it as local as possible to groups of people that want to provide something on a voluntary basis for the people who just can't, they need help.
Coming up, my final segment with educator and school abolitionist, Deb Filman, host of the Reason We Learn podcast. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
The Charles Love Show continues on AM 560, The Answer. Here's Charles Love.
Welcome back. I've reached my final segment with Deb Filman, host of the Reason We Learn podcast. And as I do, with most of my guests on all the topics we discuss. I end by asking her what we can do to turn the tide on the problems we're facing in education. And here she gives a somewhat somber response, which is true, though, saying that the answer isn't easy.
I think we can only turn ourselves around. So what I mean by that is I have immense optimism in the power of individual families to do what's right for their kids right now. In other words, they have choices right now. They could homeschool. They could get together with a group of people locally and form a micro school. They could get together with their church or organization. They could form a community after school program. There's so many things that we just started opening our mouths and talking to each other face to face that we as individuals could do to help our kids have a better childhood and a better education. And I really think that's where my hope lies, is in trying to get parents back in touch with that power, get parents back in touch with what it takes to form real community. I'm getting ready to get back out there and try to do some things in my community. And I'm also trying to do some things to encourage others using technology in a way to reach more people, just like I'm doing now, to empower them to do it in their communities. But I think if one family at a time, people start saying enough of this, I've got to parent my kids, that's what's going to turn it around.
So here's an interesting question for you. What is the biggest thing that you learned, a year and change later, since doing all the shows and talking to all these people? What is the thing that you would think that you learned the most?
I think the thing I learned the most is how resistant people are to seeing reality, even when it's right there in front of them. In other words, looking at evidence and accepting it when they have an emotional investment and not doing that. That's been the hardest lesson for me to learn, and the one that I've learned the most and that I still fight against the hardest. Because I understood the need to bring proof or bring evidence that what I was saying was true. I got it. And it was totally understand. But I'm still finding people who are looking right at it and just not willing to say that is what it is. And that's been really hard, but that's also what has convinced me that the solution is to take the people who have seen it, to take the people who are willing to move on and make a better life for their kids, and say, let's go, let's roll, let's get out. We cannot save everybody. We can't fix it. What we can do is we can build, we can create, we can innovate, we can communicate with each other better than we've been doing, and take this arc, this remnant, this whatever, the group of people who are like, I'm with you, or they don't have to be with me. It's not about me. It's just I'm with these ideas. I agree with this notion that we can do better. So I'm just going to go do it. And then we go do that. That's kind of where I'm going. And because I do think that their numbers are growing daily, I do have confidence that more and more people will suddenly drop the shades from their eyes and see it. They're just not going to do it on my schedule. So if I started off thinking I'm going to persuade people and I'm going to convince them, what I learned is maybe yes, maybe no. Right. Some yes, some not. But that doesn't mean don't do it. And it doesn't mean you're going to reach everybody, but you just, you do it. You take the people you can convince, and you go do your thing. You show compassion for the rest and hope for the best.
All right. She is Deb Filman, host of the Reason We Learn podcast. Deb, it's been great speaking with you. Went by quickly, didn't it?
It did. It always does.
Well, thank you for your time.
You're so welcome.